Welcome to the Music Production Podcast. Right now you're hearing a track called Minor Thoughts by Divorce Court. I'm playing you this track because Divorce Court is using one of my Ableton Live packs called Washed. Washed is a collection of 42 Ableton Live instruments made from samples of analog synthesizers that I ran through a host of different effects. Each patch got its own effects. And then I sampled it into Ableton Live and then put more effects that you can use inside instrument racks. It's a really cool, lush sounding pack, very analog, very pitch warbly, but still, very usable, lo-fi at times. But I think it's a really beautiful pack, and this is a great song that I think does justice to the pack. It's really nicely done. You can hear my interview with Divorce Court on episode number 78 of the Music Production Podcast. That's Lyndon Williams, who goes by the name Divorce Court. Talks a lot about his live performance, arranging tracks, and like how music hits you and what it's for when you actually produce. I think this is a beautiful track, and it makes great use of my own pack called Washed. So check out Washed. I got it at my site, AfroDJMac.com. You can just go to the store and you'll find it there. And also be sure to check out Divorce Court by going to divorcecourt.lol. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Music Production Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Funk. Today, we have the triumphant return of Jason Timothy Ward. He is the runner of the site Music Software Training. You might remember back a few episodes now, Jason was on the show before. We had a great conversation that we kind of left off saying we need to pick this up again because we weren't done talking, but we ran out of time. And finally now, sometime later, we're getting to resume. So welcome, everybody. This is Jason. What's up, Jason?
Hey. Great to be here once again.
Great to have you back. Always nice to talk to you.
Great to be here in my same studio. So I guess I'm not really being anywhere, but in the Ethernet sphere, it's a lovely place to be.
It is pretty convenient for this kind of thing, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So
because I think we
always enjoy taking the time out to have a quick chat with you.
Yeah, me too. And I know it was like we had some unfinished business. We spoke on episode 14, and this will be, I think, 105 most likely,
How incredible is that? You've done so much work since then.
It's been a lot of fun. Talking to so many different people. Even just the ones where I kind of say something that's on my mind, I've been really surprised at how much just talking through your thoughts helps you organize them and helps you understand them almost better by just trying to verbalize what you're thinking.
I think the seeds really come from the process, you know. You can't over-prepare the real gems. So you could give people some prepared gems for sure, but the real gems sometimes come right off the cuff. And from unexpected places where I think both of us agree that's kind of where most creativity comes from anyway.
Yeah, I think you can kind of be calculated, and that can be, I think, really good as far as like workflow stuff. But a lot of times the sparks are these things that just sort of happen out of nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of one of those things where you start off, you write drunk, and then you come back sober to do the editing. Right. You let the 3-year-old play around with the crayons for a while, and then you bring the adult back to just touch it up a little bit. That's always kind of been a philosophy that I like to continue to have, is hopefully to continue to have a childlike curiosity about the whole thing and never know too many things.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot. And I think I start running dry in my own stuff when I'm too analytical, when I'm thinking too much in terms of this is a technical thing, if I'm doing sound design and I'm adjusting the envelope and then I'm going to do an LFO. Like once I start thinking that way, I lose myself a lot. But when I'm in this sort of like abstract world of like, all right, I'm making like a spaceship sound or making like a laser beam, then it's not so much like, okay, well, I'm going to do the pitch envelope, I'm going to do this. It's so much more exciting and playful.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best approach that I've taught myself to take, and this isn't something that that I learned on my own. I know I heard it somewhere, but the idea is to start with an idea in your head, and then let the physical version of that kind of evolve on its own. You know, I think the spark was meant to just be a spark, and even though the spark can seem like the perfect idea, the only reason that the spark does that is to motivate you enough to sit down and do something. You know, usually the idea itself is always going to evolve, and oftentimes, most times, will become better the more you let go. And the reason I believe that is because we come across hundreds or thousands of really wonderful gems, like are probably going to happen in this podcast, where if we weren't recording and we were specifically aiming for only one thing and cutting out our attention from everything else, then we're limiting what is possible with that creative moment.
I could definitely see that. I think that's a good reason to be prolific too with your work, just because if you're focusing on one thing, one project for months and months at a time, you can't be as experimental. You can't let in these crazy ideas because you're trying to do this one specific thing. Whereas when things are less precious, maybe you're willing to just, the hell with it, let's try it. You know, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
For me, I gave up a long time ago on trying to control where my ideas come from, and trying to judge a work by how it was assembled. I find that the assembly could be really simple, or it could be really layered, it could be really complex. And none of those defines necessarily whether it's going to be any good or not. So for me, anything and everything is there's a spark for a song right there. Great. And it's usually from either another song or a lyric where I thought it said something, but it didn't. So I'm like, oh, I'm going to steal what I thought it said. Or, you can come to terms with music through art. A great band that I love in the electronic space is Underworld, who both are very artistic and also very creative musically, and they solve a lot of their problems musically from what they learn from their art. You know, that's why I think so many great bands start off as art students. I kind of wish that I had come from the same background, but I've certainly learned a lot from them.
Yeah. Well, I like that idea of not worrying too much about how it was constructed and put together, because that's sort of what I was getting at, I think, when I'm saying I'm getting too analytical and I'm not feeling, I'm like analyzing, I guess, and
right.
And like you said, the idea, it doesn't matter how it's put together. What matters in the end is how it moves you, how it affects you.
Sure.
And no one cares what compressor you use. No one cares if you used a compressor.
They really don't. And some great albums don't use compressors, because, let's say an artist is using samples that the sounds are already compressed. Why do they need to, I think it's more an idea of allowing the quickness of your brain to go into action and go into flow. Flow doesn't last forever. So if you stop too many times and interrupt that flow, it's very similar to like when you're reading a book, it always starts off where you're just seeing words on a page. It takes a little time before those words actually turn into a visual. And once you're in the visual, you almost stop seeing the words altogether. And then something will spark your attention and take your attention away. And all of a sudden the pictures go away and you got to start back on reading words again. Right. I think that can be the same thing on a musical level.
Yeah, that moment when the ideas are coming is so like fickle. It's so happy to run away and leave and disappear that you almost have to like guard it with your life to keep it going
Yeah, it's funny because you need to guard it with your life, and at the
without
same time,
trying to guard it at
and
all.
at the same time, you can't give it that much importance, or you'll lose it
Right.
by
As
giving
soon
it too
as you
much
say, this
importance.
is it, this is the one, this is
Yeah,
the.
exactly. It's the same thing that I discovered when I won't say often. Sometimes I go through periods where it happens often, but it's like when I'm lucid dreaming. And the moment I realize I'm lucid dreaming, if I get too excited, I'll wake myself right up. So I have to like control and go, okay, this is cool. I'm
Mhm.
chill. I'm in control of this dream, but I'm not going to freak out about it. You know? Yeah. Flow, what I find, and here's the thing that so many people don't get, I think, and that I didn't get either, is that flow usually comes after a meltdown, a creative meltdown that you have.
Hmm.
It's because meltdowns happen when you're pushing your brain to actually use its thinking process. And your brain doesn't like to do that. Your brain likes to be in autopilot as much as possible, to reserve as much energy as possible. So you know that when you're having a breakdown, it's the brain fighting you saying, I'm not ready for this new material. I'm not ready for this new information. But then, of course, if you do this a few times, the brain goes, oh, yeah, that's what we are now. So I'm not going to give you any problem with it anymore.
Hmm.
But when you go through that breakdown, it always sparks a new discovery. And when you spark a new discovery, I think that is what often sparks flow. I mean, I think there's other ways to get into it, but I think most often it happens when you think that you're at your worst. It's usually followed by some of your best work.
Hmm.
I've found that some of the songs that I just didn't think I could go forward with, um, I kept on it. And it's usually about 2 or 3 days where I just lose all confidence in myself. Doesn't matter how many songs I finished in the past, doesn't matter how good maybe the last song I did. But all of a sudden, I'll hit a wall and start thinking that everything I've done previously was just by lucky chance, right? And it takes me a few days to get over this kind of lull in my energy, in my creativity, and a lull in my confidence. But what happens was when I found that one thing that kind of pulled things together, all of a sudden, not only my attitude and the flow came back, but the work became better than what I had done previously. Like it usually isn't like I'm kicking a dead horse. It really does turn into something that I'm proud of at the end
Mhm.
if I'm able to push myself through the process.
Hmm. I know that feeling. I sometimes feel like a magical wizard and I can do anything.
Right.
I can make a track of any kind of song, any kind of music, yeah, there are times when that's probably fantasy, but I feel that way. And then there are
Mm.
other times when I actually try to be the wizard and I just don't know how to do anything. Everything is terrible. Everything's been done before. Everything is uninteresting. Everything is uninspiring. It doesn't
Yeah.
even matter. And that's, yeah, I'd agree that a breakdown is for sure a good word for it.
Yeah. You could also have fun with it too. You could actually anticipate feeling crappy, or you could even start by saying, all right, let's make something really terrible and then make it better.
Hmm.
Because it at least gets you to start, it gets you to throw something at the wall and see what sticks. Um, if you're not willing to do that, then you're not really ever going to push yourself outside of a comfort zone. And if you don't do that, that's where writer's block will either kick in, or maybe you'll end up being like the Ramones and just make the same song many, many times, and all of them will be great in their own way.
Yeah.
That's not wrong either.
No, I love the Ramones.
Yeah.
And I know what I'm going to get when I put them on.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, exactly. I've used that actually in a new project that I'm doing, which is well, I'm keeping it a secret right now, but it's a new style that I am putting together, And it's not one that I was extremely familiar with. And it actually incorporates some styles that I'm normally not into, but by the mixture of it, it becomes something I'm very intrigued by. It's kind of dark, almost gothy-ish or whatever. But what I did, it took me a while to kind of come up with how to get these sounds that I was going for and that sort of thing. And what I decided to do is just reuse these sounds that I had spent all this time, reuse, and then I change things later. But the thing for me is to get down musical ideas. It's kind of like you can make a whole album that's going to be an electronic piece of music, but a lot of artists will start off on either a piano or a guitar because it takes away all the distraction of all the sound design and all the BS.
Right.
And it gets you right to the core of what you're doing. So I put together loads of songs that are using somewhat of the same sounds. And then once I got the basic format, then I make it become something a little different, but not too different because the style is a little bit specific, and that sort of thing. So I'm enjoying the idea of ripping myself off a little bit. As much as I enjoy the process of doing something completely new and different,
So you're starting maybe with like a stock set of sounds that you kind of, is it almost as if like you were doing like, I don't know, general MIDI sounds, then just working off of those. But I'm guessing you have your own sounds, but.
So it's really researching the style so that I'm at least inspired by the sounds, right? And what I know about layering and stacking sounds to get a fuller thing. So I'm certainly using my listening skills to get myself started. But once I do that, I'm not going and researching more and more and more after I finish the first couple songs. Instead, I'm using what I've gathered that inspires me enough to get through certain songs and get the idea down. 'Cause sometimes it's just the melody that I just have to get down. I don't care if I'm using a similar sound, if it sounds within that style,
right.
And then once again, I can change it once it becomes something else. So yeah, I wouldn't be too inspired by just general MIDI sounds. Although I will say, in the beginning, using Ableton, most of the time if I have an idea, I'll just open up Operator and put the notes in and the timing just so I don't forget it. And then I'll start tweaking the sound and let that loop kind of play until I'm inspired by it or until it starts sounding a little bit like what I had in my head.
Yeah.
And once again, I let go of what's in my head once I find something that starts sounding good to me in its own way.
Well, coming from like the background of playing guitar in bands, for the most part, the sounds were the same in every song. The main choices I had was my guitar going to be distorted or clean, and maybe I'll put like a delay on it.
Yeah, exactly. That was me too. I played in bands where I probably had maybe 5 or 6 sounds ever. That was it. And what it allowed me to do is crank out great songs that I knew would work with the band because we've already kind of dialed in our tone, if you will.
Yeah.
The drummer always plays the same kit. The bass player plays the same bass. He might have 2 basses to choose from. Me as a guitar player, I might have at the time I probably had 2 or 3 guitars to choose from. But to be perfectly honest, I didn't really care which I was using. It was the one that didn't have a broken string.
Yeah.
Same amp. Yeah, and that philosophy really helped me when it came to electronic music production because I realized, I don't have to have a new bass sound for every single song. Like, I can have some signature sounds. And a second thing is I can kind of let the sound evolve into something better and better as I get better at creating the sound, right?
Right.
So, and if I haven't released the previous songs, I could always go back and use the new sound that I've developed over time. But for the most part, I'm just dialing in the tone of one particular sound or another, and then when you have 3 or 4 of those, you kind of know your sound well enough, until you decide that you want to explore new territory, and then you learn something else. But by having only a few choices, you get better at that. And then by practicing that, when you decide to do something new, you've got all this background and confidence in yourself that you've done it before, that you don't get overly stressed about, taking on something new. You just move forward and do it and allow it to sound like crap for a little while until it sounds good. And once it sounds good, you can reuse that a little bit,
Right. That's a funny approach in that it's kind of obvious almost when you take, as soon as you take away the electronic music part and just go to any other kind of music where the ensemble or the group is pretty much the same for every song. And I get that like energy, I guess, sometimes when I go back to like the rock and roll roots, and I'm going to record the drums, and these are my drums, it's not a library of all kinds of different styles of drums that, as we were talking about earlier, where you're trying to maintain your enthusiasm and that spark. It's so easy to have that fizzle away as you look at your browser and just see never ending
it's kind of
choices.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I used to walk into rehearsal with my guitar, and maybe it'd just be me and the drummer. The other guys hadn't showed up yet. And I'd have a riff that was a similar tempo to something else we'd done. And I just asked the drummer, hey, play the beat that we play on this other song. I just want to riff on top of it. You know what I mean? That way he doesn't have to rediscover something new. He could just... once he starts, I can play, and once I play, he can react to that, and all of a sudden it becomes something a little bit new.
Yeah.
With an electronic musician, you can do the same thing, start off with the same drums, and just move a few notes and change a few sounds as the song evolves.
Right.
Why ever start with a blank slate if you don't have to? I try to avoid a blank slate as much as possible, because it immediately gets my brain into, if I have a starter beat and I have a starter bass sound, like that gets me going. And I kind of like to look at, especially the things that I'm not as good at. I like to look at those as like other members of my band. So samples are like other members of my band that, they handle that. I'm really good at these one or two things. Why not let technology be your other band members and pull those in, and don't feel any guilt about that. Instead, feel pride about being able to express the things that you're really good at within that context.
Yeah, well, that's what you would do in any other work, right? You hire someone that can do it for you, and you'll do the stuff.
Yeah. For me, I think that I'm pretty good at groove, which means I'm pretty good with drums and bass. I'm less good with melody. It takes a little bit more experimentation, or I'll straight up borrow and maybe switch a couple notes on something that inspires me. I don't overthink it though. I have no problem borrowing the things, and in my head I'll be like, thanks for that, because it's like someone coming in and giving you some idea to work with that allows you to build the thing that you're good at. Everyone has their expertise, and you don't need to be an expert at everything to be a great music producer,
Right.
Use the tools that are around you, use the samples, use the loops. Obviously, you can make all of that your own. There's so many ways that you can manipulate it. I'll give you an example of how original we are, even when we're unoriginal. All right. So think of it like the lottery, okay?
Okay.
The lottery is a very, very simple concept. You get, I believe, 42 numbers. Does that sound right to you? I don't play the lottery too much.
I think it's more, but I don't play too much either. The last time I played, it was one of these like super jackpots, hundreds of millions.
Yeah, right.
And I got nervous I would win because I realized I was like, I'll never have another authentic relationship for the rest of my life if I win this. I'll always
Oh,
be
damn,
wondering.
check you out.
But,
That's funny.
But anyway, yeah, I
So,
think it's a lot of numbers either way, right?
So let's just say it's 42 numbers. It might be a little more, a little less, but it's not that many numbers. And everyone is picking 6 out of those 42, let's say. All right. Now, how many people pick the exact same numbers? Because if something goes to like super lotto sort of numbers of $100 million, that's because no one actually picked the correct 6 numbers.
Yeah.
In the whole state for weeks on end.
Yeah, for a couple times.
That's how rare it is for 2 people to pick the same 42 or the same 6 numbers out of 42 or whatever the actual number is, right? So if we go back to music, imagine we only had 42 sounds to work with. Well, there's a whole lot more variations that can be done with those 42 sounds. I mean, we have EQs and reverbs and delays and effects and all these different things that make it even more unique. And then if we think about the idea that we don't have only 42 sounds to work with as artists, we have unlimited sounds, unlimited presets, unlimited source material. We really can stop acting like we are going to sound exactly like someone else. It's just, it's an impossibility, really.
Right.
You know? So even if we only had 100 sounds each, and all of us use the same 100 sounds, imagine how many variations we can create with that.
Yeah.
And then we'll stop worrying about our quote unquote originality.
Well,
everything that we do is just coming through our human filter, you know? So it doesn't matter the source material necessarily. We're all hearing things in a different way and putting things together in a different way, even if we're starting with very similar tools and instruments.
Yeah.
So that's my spiel.
Well, it's a great point because especially if anyone here is thinking they need more gear.
Yes.
Or if anyone's listening to this with someone who thinks they have a problem with getting more gear. So, that's a good argument because, I mean, even again, to go back to like a rock music thing, there were really just like 3 or 4 different sounds: your drums, your bass, your guitar, and maybe a keyboard or something.
Yeah.
And how many countless songs and styles of songs were invented in just that realm.
Absolutely. And some, you know, think about how many of those bands, we could even niche down further. Think of how many of those bands only really used bar chords, for example. All right. So thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of bands that, you know, they might be a pop punk or they might be one of a ton of different styles, but all based on just playing bar chords.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that at all, you know, but every one of those bands is going to have something unique, maybe inspired heavily by a particular artist, and maybe that will be noticeable, maybe it won't. But still, they're always going to be different. And the more music they make, the more you will realize that they're different from their influences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. Yeah, so we don't need a lot to be creative. We don't need a lot to be unique, really.
I think less is, well, here's the thing is, I always tell my students, you know, especially when they say, well, yeah, I'm going to take training after I buy this, or I'm going to take training once I get the right plugins or whatever. And my argument is, if you're not finishing songs with what you have, then you aren't putting your focus on the most important aspect of your music making. And it's not your technique, it's your ability to take an idea to completion. Mm-hmm. And why are you putting so many other tools in the way of you reaching that goal? Because all you're doing is not only making it more difficult for you to finish songs, but you're also giving yourself another tool that has almost unlimited capability when you really think about it. So you can go so far down the rabbit hole of a piece of equipment that it distracts you from the real goal, which is finishing songs.
Right.
You know, if your goal is to make music that people hear, then you need to start with what you have and gain confidence in the habit of finishing what you start and not really worrying too much about the perfection of it. And add tools only when you realize that you've pushed the tools you have to their limit and you start thinking, I wish I had something that did this specific thing. Mm-hmm. Then you know exactly what you're going for and you're not just, going after shiny objects.
That is excellent advice, because you are just putting more obstacles in the way of your goal of finishing your music by adding new tools. I think we've convinced ourselves, or the marketing has convinced us, that the new tool is the path to your goal of finishing the song. But, I can be a good example of a person that can tell you that's not true, where you got this, if I just get that one thing, then I'll be able to do it.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having tools, but the guys who have lots of tools, with the expensive studios and things, they often have a team of people that know those tools pretty well, not just themselves. If we look at, the more popular artists, and the ones that use all their tools, exclusively tend to know their equipment by this one piece of equipment does this one thing really well, and this other piece of equipment does this other thing really well. And they don't have to go too deep into that. They just know the 10% of that tool that works best for them.
Yeah.
And that's something that you come to slowly, I believe. Another thing too is acquisition of equipment is a type of procrastination, really. Because it does put an excuse your way for why you haven't finished anything, and another thing is there's an unconscious kind of belief system where you are putting the responsibility of your own creativity on a piece of equipment. You're actually looking for something to fix something that is broken within your own habits. Has nothing to do really with anything physical that you need to add to your arsenal, really. If you've got a DAW that you can record that has some tools built into it, then for the most part, you can finish something. And until you finish something, try not to get to the next step, because what's going to happen is that finishing song habit is just going to be pushed further and further away.
Yeah. Wise advice. Difficult to follow sometimes.
It is.
It's so easy
for all of us.
Yeah.
And
that's the
and don't get me wrong,
It's
go ahead.
These are always like I can never hear this stuff enough, because it's like you forget it the second you hear it. And
we all do it, The one thing that I do when I get really excited about a piece of equipment, and don't get me wrong, I can make something that's inspiring, but really, what I enjoy doing when it comes to that is, instead of trying to integrate that new piece of equipment into my workflow, I kind of use it as something where, when I step outside when I don't have my music producer hat on, I can just take a childlike approach and record everything that comes out of it that I do without any training for an hour or two.
Yeah.
And not really have too many goals on what's going to come out of the piece of equipment. Because then what happens is, when you go back over that without having a specific goal in mind, for example, if I were using a new piece of equipment because I was trying to get a certain bass sound and it was very specific, what would happen is, first, 80% of the time, that 2-hour session I spent trying to get that bass sound is going to fail. I'm not going to get that sound that I was going for. It happens all the time. You just don't get that perfection. The second thing is you lost 2 hours worth of all the sounds you made in between that could be brilliant, but you were ignoring them all at the time. It's much better to just explore the whole thing and record everything you're doing. You could come back to it and you might end up with 50 to 75 really interesting sounds that you would have never come up with had you been critically thinking about creating a sound. Right. And that is the most honest I can get on how I create many of my interesting sounds. They're not I don't have a preconceived notion of exactly what's going to come out of a piece of equipment. And I like that because then once it's a sample, then I limit myself and I go, I'm going to work with this. I've got enough sounds. I've got enough interesting things. I'm going to figure out by figuring out how to incorporate these things, my song's going to go in a different direction than I would have ever been able to take it if I were trying to be overly critical about every aspect of my tune.
I like that way of thinking. I'm a fan of the just let the recorder go and tinker approach. Yeah. But the point you make when we're trying to do one specific thing, like you said, if it's get this particular bass sound you have in your imagination, you do tune out all the other good stuff that could happen along the way. Yes. Because it's not the specific thing you're looking for. And there have been a lot of times where I've been doing exactly that and like something crazy happens, like, whoa, what was that? And then I'll come back to that later because right now I'm trying to do this thing. And then it's gone forever. You don't know how you do it. Because you do things, especially when something's new to you, you're doing things you will later on know better than to do. You'll be too smart to do that later.
Yeah, you'll never twist that knob. Right. That knob doesn't work. Well, how do you know that knob doesn't work? Have you given it more than 10 minutes of your time to like really explore what that crazy thing that you're not supposed to touch does? It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun pushing things beyond the boundaries, and misusing the tools is some of the most fun you'll ever have.
Yeah. That's a big favorite of mine. I recently had something happen where I was present enough to realize this was cool. For whatever reason, I was using Ableton Push. I had a microphone in my hand. And whenever I'd hold the microphone and touch one of the knobs on Push, I'd get this weird buzz. It was some kind of like ground loop issue. I don't know. But it was just like this weird buzz. And I was getting frustrated with it. And then I said, I'm just going to record it. I'm going to turn my enemy into my friend kind of thing. And And it became this thing, it's like crank the gain a little bit. It was this really weird sound, and I had a lot of fun messing with it. And on top of that, somehow the buzzing's gone away magically. I don't know what happened, what I did, what I changed, but I can't get it anymore. And I'm just like, I think of that particular sound as just a landmark, in like the creative process where
it was a visitor.
Yeah, it came and it could have totally derailed me, and I guess it did derail me in a positive way though. Whereas I was very tempted to get on the floor under the desk and start pulling things apart and figuring out what was going on, but instead I was like, no, I want to do this song. I'm working on it, and it became this like kind of weird noise that I used, and then it was gone.
That's interesting. Have you ever like been working on a tune and you hit the pause button and this weird sound carries over, but you can't recreate it because it's not literally recording inside your DAW, right? So
maybe it's like
there's been times
and things.
So there's been times where I would have to like reroute the audio. I use ScreenFlow for making my videos, but also it'll just record whatever's on the computer audio.
Yeah.
And I'll literally record these just weird sounds that happen when you hit pause, and all the effects are decaying and you just can't get it any other way. And then reincorporate that into my song. Yeah, I always am open to accidents driving my art, if you will, in a new direction,
I've never thought of ScreenFlow as a sampler until you just said that.
Sometimes it's the only thing I have available that can do the trick, so I just go for it. I'm sure there's other ways, or people used to use like Soundflower or different things like that, but with ScreenFlow, it just automatically does it. So for me, it's very quick to open it. Obviously, it records me in video looking stupid, but I just export it as audio and I'm fine.
Yeah, well, yeah, because there are certain things like that can happen, like you said, like if you hit pause and then all those decays go on, you can't record that because you have to play.
You have to hit pause. You can't hit play and pause at the same time. It's like in a car, you can't hit the brakes and the gas at the same time and expect a good result. So.
Yeah, but to use ScreenFlow like that's kind of a cool idea to get outside the boundaries of the timeline.
Yeah, there's also certain things in Ableton that you still can't automate. So sometimes you have to do it by hand and maybe record it to another track, as a resample option or something like that. And a lot of those things end up being pretty cool.
Right.
Some of them end up being garbage, but that's fine. I'd rather have many episodes of 15 minutes of garbage for 10 seconds of brilliance, because those little 10 seconds are things that are never going to return,
Yeah.
So I always look at those as a real gift.
Well, I think it's a smart thing to do anyway, just for your own sanity while you're trying to make music. Again, to go back to my example, it could have went a lot of other ways, and it usually does probably, where next thing you know, you're rearranging, you're pulling things apart, you're trying to figure out what the problem is. I mean, how many times have any one of us had time to make music that was just spent trying to solve some problem or figure out why this isn't happening and why this is...
Oh, yeah. It's always the 10 steps that you realize that you didn't realize that you had to take before you are able to do the thing that you had on your list.
Yeah.
It happens to me all the time. And that's why what I try to do is, if I'm planning like a session of some sort, I try to, the night before, kind of do the busy work part.
Yeah.
Because I'll usually find out that there's a few steps that need to be taken that would really hold me up the next day. Doesn't always work, because sometimes I just run into more problems, but at least it solves some of the problems the day before.
Yeah, you don't have your collaborators like watching you trying to figure out, why isn't this making any sound?
I've had just the worst luck sometimes. Like, I have 4 computers, and they all do something that they all have a quirk or something that's not working. One of them requires like a FireWire cable, and another one, for some reason, when you use this plugin, it doesn't work quite well. And you're trying to bounce back and forth, and it's like, I swear to you, it's like the gods have been against me, because every computer gets me almost there, but all of them have a limitation in another way that keeps me from doing the one thing I want to do. Luckily, I think I've exorcised those demons, because they haven't come back in a while. But boy, in the early days, it was crazy.
Oh yeah. Well, I've had plenty of times where I'll be talking to someone, a friend of mine. I'm so psyched, we got to play some music. Then they get there, and I don't know why it's not working. I was just doing it yesterday.
Oh God. Yeah. Exactly. No. Yeah, you're all of a sudden one of your cables is out, or your sound card's not working, or whatever the heck it is. It will happen.
Yeah, it does. Hey, so some of the stuff you were kind of mentioning makes me think a little bit about what you were talking about right before we started recording. This idea you have of recovering these abandoned songs. And
yeah,
I know we're all guilty of this. Admit it, everybody. I admit it. There's so many unfinished ideas, abandoned ideas, things that I was very excited about at one point, even that for whatever reason, I just never got around to putting the final touches on or taking it to the next stage.
Right. Yeah. I've discovered for me, and testing this with a number of other people, at least testing this information, that a lot of people feel the same way. Um, that you know, you start off with something that usually sparks an interest and gets you excited, and then what'll happen is you'll start adding layers, and every layer will sound better than the last thing. And every layer you add sounds better and better. But the problem is that you're only comparing it to the last incremental move that you made. You
Mm.
know, uh, you're if you go from having 8 sounds originally to having 30 sounds, you're only comparing the difference between the 29th sound and the 30th sound. So you're kind of losing perspective of what the stripped down idea really was, right? And another thing that happens is that your imagination actually makes you hear things differently, which is why the next day you'll come back to the song and ask yourself who changed all the settings, because it sounds like nothing like the masterpiece that you thought you had made before. Um, and that's part of the childlike approach that is truly a gift in some ways. But when you come back the next day, you have to put on your more experienced hat and really look at it objectively. And what most people will do is say, well, this song is certainly not what I wanted. And first thing you want to do is trash it and hide any evidence that it was ever something existed in your arsenal, right? But what I've found is that there's ways that you can not only recover these songs and get the spark back, but that these songs could become actually some of your best work, right? Because I think your best work happens when you push yourself in a little bit of a new direction. And there's no way to do that unless you reflect on your mistakes. When you let go too early and you throw away your mistakes, what's going to happen is that you're going to keep on making the same mistakes because that's your process. You haven't told your brain to do anything differently. And you've also trained your brain to give up the second something doesn't sound great to you, the second the magic is lost. And every song goes through a period where the magic is completely lost. It could be one session where you feel like that. It could be it could be for several days. Consider if you're working on it every day, you're going to at least go through
Yeah.
3 to 4, maybe even 5 days of feeling the song's not quite there. But then you can come to a certain discovery that brings it all together. So yeah, I wanted to share just some steps that I would take if you are, struggling with a song that you just feel has lost it, or you're starting to feel like it never had it, right? This is what I've done, and I would say 90% of the time, the song ends up getting finished and is good enough for release. Which that's big,
That's
because
huge, yeah.
if you can recover 90% of your bad ideas, then you're really never going to have bad ideas anymore, because your brain's going to know that there's actually a great idea hiding inside of it. Okay. So this is really simple. So the very first step that I would take is, obviously open up your song and mute everything. You could leave the levels where they're at, but mute everything. And then what you're going to do is one at a time, you're going to, probably start with your kick drum, add more drums one at a time. And when you're mixing, what I would recommend that you do is 2 things. Most of us mix from low to high. And when we mix from low to high on our volume level, what happens is we don't hear it, we don't hear it, we don't hear it. Oops, it's too loud. And there's not that in between, because that sound hasn't caught our attention yet. So we end up turning things up too loud because we're trying to hear something that the brain hasn't attached itself to. And when you do that, what happens is usually the last thing that you mix ends up being the loudest, and the first thing you mixed ends up getting buried, which is why you're always thinking at the end, or at least when you're beginning in music production, you're always wondering why your kick sounds buried by the end of your mix. And you always feel like you need to turn it up or something like that. There's a good reason why. So what I would recommend you do is when that new sound comes in, turn it louder than you know it needs to be, and then pull the sound down until get it as low as you can until it stops having an effect on your song. And that is usually the right place. It's kind of like when a beautiful woman walks very close to you at a party, and then she gets lost through the crowd. You're still able to see her in the crowd. Whereas if she just starts off far away, you're never going to notice her until she's all the way up close, right next to you, sort of thing. So I think that philosophy is helpful as you go through each of these sounds, adding one sound at a time. Now, here's the thing. You're going to get to a point where you run into a sound that doesn't improve the groove or makes the groove sound slower than you want it to, or makes it sound like something is being covered up or something is sounding a little muddy or what have you. Those are really important to kind of keep in mind. And what I recommend you do is if something's not working right away when you mix it as is, just mute it and move on to the next sound that is working. So what's going to happen is by the end of this process, all the sounds that you have that are unmuted are going to be mixed well, and they're actually going to be moving your groove forward, right? So that's step one. The next step is, what are we going to do with these sounds that aren't quite working? So the things that I recommend are usually one of three things. It's really, really simple, once again. The first thing is the placement of the sound, the timing at which it is. Oftentimes we use, let's say, cut up samples that are like really short bits. And maybe they're just in the wrong place and they're covering something else that needs to be exposed for the groove to really come back to life. So by simply moving a sound or maybe a MIDI note that's a little off, just by 1/16th note or 1/8th note to the left or to the right, you might be able to find a better location that re-inspires the groove and re-inspires you to feel that the sound is starting to work again. If that doesn't work for you, then what may be an issue is maybe you need some reductive EQ. Maybe it's taking up too much space, and maybe you need to process it a little differently. EQ is usually the obvious first choice. And then, sometimes you could process the sound in a way or add a delay or do something that moves with the groove. That would be my second tip. My third tip is maybe the sound is taking up too much time space. And maybe by just backing off the decay of that sound and making it shorter, you're freeing up some space so that the other sounds can breathe. Because on its own, it might sound great, but within the context of your full song, it may be taking up too much space. And if it's a loop or something, maybe there's whole parts of that loop that you could just turn down completely and just use the one or two little sounds that actually adds to the groove. Very, very simple. Another thing I'll say with timing is if you're working with a loop, you've got your arrow that is your start point in Ableton on your clip. And if you just move that arrow 1/16th note forward at a time and just experiment with how the groove changes to unexpected things as you move it, some of it's going to sound like garbage, but there might be something that sounds even more inspiring than the original idea. So something to consider. And if none of those work, then you have exhausted all your options with that sound and you might as well just delete it. And what you're going to end up with by doing this process through all the sounds that aren't working is something where every sound is contributing to the groove. And then you will most likely find your spark and be able to move forward from there. So that's my whole spiel on that.
Hmm. A lot of the stuff I abandon is very very developed with a ton of tracks like that, and
Mm.
sometimes you're right. Like I mean, just taking some stuff out, even because
Yeah,
I like
for
that point you
sure.
make that you're just comparing it to the last thing you had, and if you start getting to this point where you're really only adding like these incremental improvements that are
Or at least what you think are improvements,
right, and
you
now you're
know.
kind of like improving on barely improving, and it just sort of kind of starts to collapse on itself.
Well, you don't notice it when it starts taking a downward
Mm.
approach, when it's just incremental.
Yeah.
You would literally have to turn off everything and compare that one new sound on top of your groove, which is something that you're not really often going to do.
Hmm.
So you need to sometimes step back and get perspective of what are the most important elements of your song. For example, I recommend that people get the bass in there right after the groove as soon as possible, because if if the bass is driving your song, which in many songs it does, anything that you add to that is either going to help that or hurt that sound coming through your mix. You usually want that to come in clean. But if you are adding too many things around it, sorry, my cat.
It's okay. Cats visit the podcast all the time.
Yeah, go on. I think that, yeah, when you're looking at things incrementally, uh, things can incrementally go south without you really knowing it. It's kind of like when you're working with an EQ, you're moving it a little bit at a time, but you're not turning the whole EQ off and comparing what you've got to what the original sound was.
Hmm.
And if you don't take the time to do that, sometimes you lose perspective in the little minor changes that might not be working.
Yeah. I like your idea too of kind of turning something up until you notice it, then bringing it back a little bit.
Mm.
I think I in my head anyway, I attribute this to Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, but this idea like when a new sound comes in, they would make it very loud in the mix and then just pull it down. Like
Mm.
here it is. I noticed it kind of like your beautiful woman in the party
Yeah.
theory. And once you notice it, it's there. And you
Yeah,
can
that's
get away
actually an
with
incredible
it's like a
idea that can be used.
psychological
Mhm.
trick almost.
I think that there's something to that. I do that at times. And another thing I'll do is sometimes, instead of adding an extra part when my song needs a little bit more, it needs to grab your attention a little bit, is what I might do with a certain part is I'll maybe every 16 bars, I'll kind of spike the volume, just up, and then I'll slowly slope it down where it comes down maybe 5 dB, where you're not really noticing. But then at the end of that, it resets, and all of a sudden it sounds like a new sound is coming in just because it's jumping in a little bit louder. So
Hmm.
just by kind of turning it a little bit too loud and then letting it fade over 16 bars and then letting it jump up again at the new set of a 16 bar, it keeps you from needing to continue to add too many sounds, because you're recreating the interest. It's just like a crash cymbal every 16 bars kind of re-wakes you up, and it tells your brain, oh yeah, okay, now we can listen for another 8 bars without getting bored.
Yeah.
Those little fills and little extra things. Even if everything else is the same, those are like the little things that will drive the listener forward.
Yeah. It's a lot actually.
Yeah.
It can be a subtle thing. A
Hmm.
little change can go a long way. And that's maybe something for us all to remember too, that because I think the tendency is to overcomplicate things. So we forget that sometimes it only takes a little thing to make a big difference and to make an impact. But we
Definitely.
tend to go for
Definitely.
some giant major thing, and then next thing you know, you have all these giant major things canceling each other out.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. It's it can be, that's the balance that we as artists always have to figure out, is what is too little and what is too much.
Hmm.
you know and for me, and the process that I like to teach my students, is really that answer comes by just developing your listening skills,
Hmm.
because when you can listen and you can hear it in another song, um, only then are you going to consider it for your own. If you don't hear those little details that add so much to your track, or add so much to the tracks that you love, then you're never really going to consider it for your own song.
Mm.
Although you will still unconsciously notice that this song clearly has something that my song doesn't. I just don't know what it is yet.
Yeah.
So by really trying to practice your ability to listen and hear, you can tell, you'll start to be able to tell intuitively when you've taken something too far
Mm-hmm.
or haven't taken something far enough.
Right, right. Yeah, and we also have, I guess, that like kind of thing where if you're doing your own track, you're never really hearing it for the first time. So I find I tend to forget about kind of like the warm up phase of the listening process, where
Yeah.
the listener needs to sort of like get accustomed to what's happening a little bit, whereas someone like me that's making the song, I know everything, I know every part, so like it makes sense in my head right away. But
Yeah.
sometimes there have been times where I come back to old tracks and I push play and it's just like, whoa, like I'm being hit with too many things at once and it sounds like garbage like just coming at me.
Sure. And it's really because your brain can handle your brain can handle your ideas.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's almost like you put a bunch of what you think are good ideas together, but your brain cancels out the ones so that you're only focused on maybe some of the newer sounds or what have you. When someone hears it for the first time, they don't know what to focus on necessarily. You know, I've found that with a lot of people where, I've helped figure out what, problems they were having with their tracks. And oftentimes it's, they start the track off without warming people up, and they give them too many things to listen to too quickly.
People do that with their writing a lot too. I will often like have students read what they wrote, and they will read what they meant to write. And when you then when you read it to them, what it actually says, they're surprised. And I've had that happen to me. I put notes up, and I know what it's supposed to say, and then someone else reads it, and I realize I've got a mistake in there, or it's very convoluted language that's could have been simplified quite a bit. And I think there's some kind of crossover there with music too, where we know what it's supposed to sound like. We know what all the things that are happening are, but when you're hearing it for the first time, sometimes you almost
and that's the thing is when we get too close to our work, we do hear it the way that we think it's supposed to sound, even when it doesn't.
Yeah.
And that's the part. This is another reason why I recommend that people don't do their own mastering, is for that very reason as well, is that you only have the perspective for the things in the song that you find most important. And there might be some really glaring errors in your song that you don't even notice because maybe it's something that you only spent 10 minutes on, but your brain is focused on the thing that you spent hours or days on.
Right.
That might not even be that important. And when you perfect that one sound, it screws everything else up. And it takes someone else hearing it for the first time to hear those really glaring or subtle errors in what you're doing. And they might send you back to do another mix, or they might be able to, take care of it in that process, whatever. But I find that incredibly beneficial to have someone else who has perspective that you're just not capable of having on your own.
Well, again, to keep the writing metaphor going, it would be no one edits their own writing, like no author,
Right.
Like usually you have an editor,
Yeah.
because they'll see what you're missing.
Yeah, and when you build a relationship with your editor in the same way that you would build a relationship probably with a particular mastering engineer, they get to know what you're trying to say, And when they know what you're trying to say, then they get better at editing your work. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Rules we all break, though.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we break the rules occasionally after we learn them to see if there's any new information that has gone undiscovered,
Mhm.
and sometimes there is. Sometimes there's a new perspective where there is an exception to the rule. There's always an exception to the rule,
Mhm.
but it doesn't make the rule any less important.
Right, right. So, man, you've got like some cool stuff that you've been working on a lot, like with the Facebook Live posts, and are you prepared to talk about podcasting stuff, or is this
Well, okay, so
am I
yeah, I'm prepared to talk
yeah,
about it. I just don't have like a link or whatever. But what it will probably
a little
be to
teaser
make it,
maybe? Yeah.
yeah, to make it very simple, the location of the podcast will just be musicsoftwaretraining.com/, and it'll be a numeric number. So it'll be 1 will be the first episode, 2 will be the second. So maybe by the time you hear this, that'll be up. But at the moment, I'm waiting for my first episodes to be approved,
Hmm.
and they should be. We'll see how it goes. I'm just learning how to do it. I'm actually using SoundCloud, which is a little bit complicated, but since I already have a pro account, I figure, I have unlimited storage there. I might as well use that. And it actually does work well once you figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically what I want it to do, my goal is obviously to share my philosophy in as many ways as possible. I've got my book on Kindle, The Mental Game of Electronic Music Production. And that's one avenue, that's one spoke of how I can express my philosophy. And in other ways, I'll kind of go off the cuff and do these Facebook Lives where I'm able to interact with people, but I got a fairly good idea of what I want to talk about. And I'm totally open to the direction going in other ways. So the podcasts are kind of like edits of that, of those conversations that I find most relevant. So I can kind of give people, kind of more bite-sized information and just pack all the gems, together more closely if at all possible. And podcast is just a great way to be found, a great way to find a new audience. It's really interesting that, there's Twitter users like yourself, and, there's Facebook users, and sometimes they don't commingle so much. There's Instagram users. There's, everything has its own kind of audience, even though some of them integrate. I think it's really important to, if your goal is really to share value with people, then you need to try to find avenues without wearing yourself out, where new people can find you.
Mhm.
And that's really the goal of the podcast, is just to be able to do that. And, I think that hearing someone's voice and hearing someone in a conversation really does help to build some sort of affinity with the person, at least feel whether, you can either relate to that person or not, but it kind of, it puts people on one side of the fence or the other. And I think that's a very good thing, because it helps connect you with people that really do connect with you. And it kind of keeps the people away that want something different.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot to say yet about the podcast, but there should be quite a few episodes coming up. I'm obviously going to, until I get to a certain point with the podcast, I'm going to try to fill the podcast up with, at least a good 20 episodes, as soon as possible over the next month. So there might be new ones daily being posted up and just waiting for their approval. And it's just all, different aspects of my philosophy, like I said, that I write in my books, philosophies that I've written over the past years on my blogs, and just personal interactions that I have when I decide to go live and interact with people directly and see what other people are concerned about and see if I have an approach or philosophy or technique that can be helpful right in that moment. I just want to kind of put all those together in as many places as possible.
Nice. I look forward to that. I find for me, like the podcasting medium is great just because I spend a lot of time driving to and from all the different places I go. So I have a lot of time for that. Whereas I don't always have the amount of time to like watch the video or to even read sometimes. So everything's limited, I guess. So it's a place that I carve out a little time for some learning, and a lot of times it's podcasts or it's listening to books or something like that. But
Yeah, I totally agree. There's I get so much joy out of being home, and like cooking can be kind of like a bummer sometimes. Like, it's going to take a while, but it's going to be good when it's done.
mhm.
But if I've got like a podcast going while I'm doing it,
Yeah,
all of it's enjoyable. I enjoy the cooking process, the cutting, all the
yeah,
preparation, and I just feel like I'm feeding my brain something really interesting. Sometimes it'll be, helpful things, and other times it'll just be like really cool things that I wasn't aware of. For example, I really like, and it's been around for a while, I think, but I really like listening to hardcore history. I
oh, I
think the
love it.
guy's name is
Dan Carlin.
Dan Carlin. Yeah.
Yeah,
And he just goes, I mean, obviously, uh, one episode, that's like a whole week worth of cooking for me,
yeah,
But he goes in such depth in these things, pieces of history that you would have never considered. It just makes you feel, a bit smarter in that thing. And
yeah.
podcasts just always seem to, um, well, I will admit that except for a few podcasts that I listen to, yours included, I'm kind of like I used to be when I would walk into a record store. It's like I'd always know what I was looking for until I stepped into the store, and then I'd completely forget. And I'm kind of like that with podcasts. It's like I don't even know what I want. There's too
Yeah,
many choices. So what I have to do is take notes on things that I want to either learn about or things that I just want for entertainment value in a podcast, and it's always there once I know what I'm looking for. So it's good fun.
yeah, for sure. Well, I'm glad you're going to be accompanying me on my drives in the future too. So that's going to be fun for me.
Yeah, hopefully it's something that it's an experiment like everything, and hopefully it's something that I keep up with, and hopefully the material seems to continue to flow from me.
Hmm.
We all as creative people have our lulls, whether it be in writing our songs or sharing value with other people.
Mhm.
Sometimes we go through periods where we feel like we've said everything we need to say. Um, and my one way out of that, I don't know if it's similar for you, is you could always say a similar thing in a different way from a different perspective, and it can actually add new value that you didn't think you were adding before, because you always, with the reference of the same material, you're a different person than you were the first time that you
Mhm.
talked about it.
Yeah,
So, in that way, I kind of have no problem reviewing some of the things and maybe even improving upon some of that. But for now, I think I've got a lot of new material that'll be fresh for people, and I'm really excited about that.
yeah. Well, that's cool, and I think it's like we just said. I mean, half of the things we talk about, we know, and we still make the mistakes, and we need the
Hmm.
reminder. And you might even know you're going through that part of the process where you feel completely powerless and you can't ever write music. Everything was a fluke beforehand. You're
Yeah,
in the stage, but still, it's real when you're there.
it's definitely real when you're there. The thing I have discovered though is that after you've been through it 4 or 5 times, the brain will reassure you a lot more. The brain
Mhm.
will be like, we've been here before. This ain't nothing but a thing. You know
Yeah,
what I mean? But the first few times, you always have to convince yourself. And then you hit a new level of fear, I guarantee. And your brain will go, oh, crap, we haven't been here before. And you're going to have to push through that as well. It's always another level and another level.
it's a new low.
Never ending.
Well, listen, man, it was really awesome talking to you again. I want to be respectful of your time and everything. Is there anything like any place in particular? I mean, obviously we got the website, but I know you're doing like the Facebook stuff live a lot.
Sure.
Is there where do you want to direct people? Because I mean,
Well,
there's so many places. You mentioned your book real quick in passing, The Mental Game of Electronic Music Production, and that's
yeah,
fantastic. And it's one thing I love about your work is you're in the mental game, and it's not so. I mean, you do it too. You do cover like technical things, how to do this, how to EQ or compress something. But
sure. Right.
I think what makes your angle on everything neat is the mental side, the philosophical side, and kind of thinking about how the brain works stuff that I find
I
really
think
interesting.
I think it's so important that people look at uh, their brain as that's the power source. No tool is the power source of the brain. You know, the way your mind works, the way your brain works. Um, and the only way that you're going to accomplish more is to get your brain what it needs to be able to um, process all this useful information that you have and organize it in a way where, you know, you don't want to be a person with a big toolbox and no blueprint,
Hmm.
you know, and the blueprint really comes from obviously the habits that you repeat and the way that your brain works and your belief systems within all that, you know. So um, as far as where I could, you know, drive people or direct people to, I'll give you a few things. If you guys are Facebook people, you might want to find the Ableton Live videos and music software training. I know that's a big bunch of words. Ableton Live videos and music software training page. You could search that and that'll come up. Much easier to remember. My Instagram is Ableton Music Habits. And that's also going to be the podcast. But the podcast is going to be Ableton and Music Habits because not everything's going to be related to Ableton in there. And if you guys are so inclined to want to work with me in some way or fashion, you could, of course, come to my website, musicsoftwaretraining.com, and check out the site. If you want to work with me more directly or privately, musicsoftwaretraining.com /application. Yeah, you do got to answer some questions if you want to work with me direct, because I need to know that you're the right fit and all that sort of stuff. Although I'm always happy to share all the free stuff for you guys. Just like Brian here, our time does become more and more valuable the longer we go into, you know, this sort of business. And we do need time to clear our brains in order to offer more value.
Right on. Well, I appreciate your time very much and taking this chance to sit down, and it's been great. Lots of good stuff. I look forward to as I clean it up and edit it. You know, I should like to listen back, so I'll probably be making little notes in my own personal notebook here. Just some great advice, especially about like rescuing those forgotten, abandoned tracks.
Well, I appreciate, you know, I come to these sitting down with you with kind of a blank slate. You know, I don't really know exactly what we're going to talk about. And you just seem to pull these things out of me. And I'm not exactly sure how, but I sure do appreciate it because, you know, not only do I speak this for other people and hope that they get something out of it, but, you know, I sometimes return to what I say so I could take my own advice as well.
Yeah. Oh, me too. Believe me, I'm trying to learn harder than anyone. Because by doing all this is a great reminder for me.
All right. Well, it's been wonderful talking with you, Brian, and I hope you have a great one. Let's keep in touch.
We will, I'm sure. Thanks everyone for listening. Again, head over to musicsoftwaretraining.com. That's the hub. That's the main spot there. You can find all the other stuff, and be on the lookout for the podcast. And thanks so much for listening. Enjoy your day.